Hi, and welcome to the Antonette's podcast. This is the second podcast in a series of podcasts, and I am a little, by way of background, is I am the author of 10 books, including titles, Essays on Social Issues and How They Impact African Americans and Other People of Color, Law, Race, and the Constitution in the Obama Context, Cliff Notes of a Warrior, on Words and Wisdom, and several other titles. And I'm also the graduate of 6 different universities. I possess 3 different law degrees, a JD, Juris Doctor degree, and 2 Master of Laws degrees. And I've also passed 2 bar exams. So I'm going to speak a little bit about African American attorneys and the business of law. So in the book Law, Race, and the U.S. Constitution that I wrote circa 2013, I talk a little bit about what it means to be a JD or, in the legal profession. And so this was a book that I wrote, and now I'm just sharing a little bit about it at this particular time. So, taken from the text is the article I wrote for the book, African American Attorneys, the Business, for the book and also for another purpose, African American Attorneys, the Business of Law or the Business of Change. And it discusses Charles Hamilton Houston's contributions to the American legal context and the reinvention of the social engineer in the 21st century. And so last week I talked a little bit, I talked a little bit by way of introduction. And now that I've gotten past the introduction, I expressed that I would talk about the theoretical paradigm mapping the colonial context into the legal sphere. The introduction last week was about how African American attorneys are kind of this segue or kind of work as mediators in their communities, in their families, in their work obligations, and what is the primary role of African American attorney or a black attorney? Is the primary role just to amass monetary wealth? Is it to be a social advocate? Is it to just advocate for and practice law? What are the responsibilities of the African American attorney? And I looked at it from several different perspectives, and I'm looking at it also from Frantz Fanon, who was a very prolific and well-known scholar and an advocate and a voice in terms of culture and race and politics. And so I did a quote from Frantz Fanon in his book, The Wretched of the Earth. And then I am now looking at theoretical paradigm, again, mapping the colonial context into the legal sphere. And so I'm just going to get into it now. We're going to look at the theoretical underpinnings. So it begins here. Although Frantz Fanon in his work, The Wretched of the Earth, clearly distinguished the context of the developing world from that of the developed world, we can use a paradigm of the colonizer colonized in a generic understanding of the terms. Here defined, colonizer/colonized is redefined as those who own economic, political, and social capital, and those who lack significant economic, political, and social capital, when such resources are compared among groups. The paradigm is not dictated solely by race, but may be more a reflection of a class society. Unfortunately, the total demise of a colonized society has not materialized. Statistical data supports emphasis of race remaining a factor in terms of class as African Americans continue to reflect the underemployed, undereducated, and over-incarcerated. If we accept a paradigm of the colonized/colonizer introduced by Fanon, wherein African Americans in America comprise a colonized people of sorts, and the larger American context constitutes the colonizer, then the African American attorney, and by extension the social engineer, act as negotiators and mediators between the masses and the elite. In effect, their role is not to engineer change, but to maintain peaceful relations between 2 contentious factions of society. The colonizer and the colonized, or the elite and the masses, through representing the poor, interpreting the law for the legally illiterate, role modeling for the ambitious, and assisting the financially less fortunate, the reality of a class society seems more navigable and less oppressive without the transfer of real power. Nevertheless, the fortunate consequence of the role of mediator, negotiator, is that these African American attorneys create opportunities for other promising African Americans or blacks. These capitalized opportunities create an inner circle of reputable professionals who act as the vanguard of the black community. Frantz Fanon clearly stated that the colonized intellectual was one who acted as a mediator / negotiator between the masses and the elite. He acknowledged that colonialism in Africa was distinct from the American slavery context. However, a 2011 reinterpretation of Fanon's work and the use of contemporary scholars allows for the American context to be viewed as a colonial society of sorts. In this colonial society, the culture and language of the oppressed society is manipulated and transformed to create influence and power of the oppressor over the oppressed. In essence, gangster hip-hop and misogynistic images of African American women, as well as glorification of materialism and aspirations of individuals and superficial bourgeois lifestyles are rampant, while emphasis on family and nation building, developing a distinctly positive African American consciousness, and lauding the benefits of education and discipline takes a back seat in mainstream entertainment media. This is not to deny the deeply religious roots of the African American community, nor the diversity of class and culture in the African American community. It is rather to say that the colonial context is one in which African Americans have moved from the confines of the slavery regime to the mainstream in many respects, while assimilation has not been conducive to creating paradigms that uplift the masses of black people. Rather, a few blacks achieve and succeed while the masses remain the proletariat. These are those who work low-level janitorial, secretarial, and assistant jobs because of subpar academic achievement, or the institutional structures that have historically played a role in African American underachievement, namely racism, prejudice, and discrimination. And that's not to say that these particular positions are not worthy of acclaim, because there is a sense of respect and a sense of pride in every job and every employment opportunity. But just by way of economic understandings, these particular positions have been, quote unquote, reserved for those who have not amassed the same level of education as some other individuals. Moreover, many perceive that there is still a glass ceiling, or believe that having to work twice as hard to get half as far remain realities for some black professionals. Accepting this colonial paradigm in America, while acknowledging its many nuances, creates a need to understand the role of the African American attorney in the 21st century. This postulation, however, considers that the constraints on black agency may be self-imposed and not externally manipulated. The African American attorney is powerful in that her role provides a means by which society quells rebellions by the masses and solidifies acquiescence from the discontent through the legitimate practice of law. In some respects, the African American attorney is a cog in the wheel, but simultaneously wields the power to determine the destiny of constituents of his or her own community. That is, he is powerful in his community of origin, but relatively powerless in the community at large. By extension of the idea of power constraints on colonialized individuals in Fanon's work, the extent of African American attorneys' power in the community at large is limited by the constraints of what he is allowed to do and how he is allowed to manipulate situations as an attorney in a majority society. An African American associate at a firm must work within the confines of the firm and under the leadership of the partners in the work in which he chooses to engage. The African American public interest lawyer is limited by the resources of the nonprofit. The elected official is limited by partisan politics. The African American legal intellectual is constrained by the university or think tank under which he is employed. The sole practitioner must adhere to the laws of the land, the rules of the courtroom, and constraints of the economy and the whim of clients. Thus, it becomes necessary for the African American attorneys to implement strategies that allow the assertion of agency in an environment hostile to such agency or unwieldy individualism. The African American attorney is therefore constrained by the same resource and authoritarian limitations as the attorneys of other races and ethnicities. However, the unique history and link between the African American attorney, the masses, and the elite create a unique situation for the African American attorney. The African American attorney, while struggling to create an economically viable situation for himself, is also forced into the position by family members forced into the position of assisting others simultaneously. He will be called upon by family members to help pay college tuition and medical bills. She will be asked by aspiring attorneys for references and recommendations. She will often be the center of her friend circle, and this will all exist while the African American attorney, or black attorney, is trying to establish a name for himself and his family. While all races may have obligations to family and friends, the African American community is distinctive in that a whole dialogue and story of the black professional looking back to help his community after he has acquired success has been pervasive in mainstream dialogue and has worked to create feelings of obligation among some black professionals. Some scholars argue that the 21st century African American attorney is indistinguishable from the majority population attorney. This is largely true in terms of lawyering techniques and education and many social experiences. However, blacks or African Americans still comprise a disproportionate percentage of the underprivileged. The African American attorney may no longer be a negative statistic. The African American attorney may have created a lifestyle of comfort and prestige. However, the African American attorney is still African American, and the interjections of racially charged discussions, for example, in Barack Obama's election, and sporadic happenings based on race, the Gen 6, create a need for the African American attorney to assess his role in society. Perhaps this would be the last century in which African Americans are underrepresented among the elite and overrepresented among the struggling. However, the African American attorney is still aware of race and is not far removed from the discussions of race and the reality of the race struggles of the early and mid 20th century. The African American attorney negotiates and mediates between family responsibilities, peers, colleagues, mentees, seeking advice and connections, supervisors, partners, and bosses who are scrutinizing the work of minorities and whose perceptions of African Americans begin with the word affirmative and end with the word action. He is also faced with the personal struggle of living up to the standards and expectations of others and maintaining a lifestyle of comfort and socially acceptable professionalism for self. Unlike many members of the majority society, the African American attorney often has been merely a generation away from the first college-educated person in his family and a paycheck away from unemployment at the beginning of her career. This is reflected in race-specific generational wealth, business ownership, and societal prestige. In fact, although black wealth has increased, the gap between the wealth possessed by white and black families grew more than 4 times larger between 1984 and 2007. It therefore becomes necessary to consider the role of the 21st century lawyer as social engineer, one who impacts wealth and power disparities. So this concludes the conceptual and theoretical background mapping the colonial context that I discussed in my book, Law, Race, and the Constitution in the Obama context. And I'll continue with this particular article in the book on the next podcast. And what I'll be looking at, and just to sum up this particular podcast here, we look at the specifics of how the African American professional or how the African American or black professional or black attorney is the mediator, how they have to navigate the resources of, say, a nonprofit, or how you have to, if you're working for a nonprofit, or how you are mediating your family dynamics, if you're an aunt or a mother or a father or a sister or a brother, a nephew, so on and so forth, niece, so on and so forth, but you are a professional that has an impact on the relationship you have to your family members, because they, in essence, will look at you and inevitably look at you as a central figure in the life of the family. And also looking at, if you are a professional and you have constraints in your professional context, that professional context, you're navigating the professional world, and you're also navigating communities and society at large, in addition to your family and your own personal responsibilities that you have to take into consideration. So this concludes this particular podcast for this week on mapping the colonial context. Looked at Frantz Fanon, and also looked at the specifics of what it means to navigate and mediate a society. Next week, we'll look at Charles Hamilton Houston and the birth of the idea of a social engineer. What is a social engineer? Who is a social engineer? What does a social engineer do? And what are his or her responsibilities in terms of being a professional in society? So thank you. This has been Antonette's podcast.